Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're diving into a really fascinating new book called DNA Narrative. It puts forward this incredible idea, a whole new way of looking at pretty much every story you've ever known and loved, from ancient Greek plays all the way to the shows you're binging right now.
So let's just jump right in. The author, Een Nurhasanah, kicks off her whole investigation with this one question. You know that feeling, right? That little sense of déjà vu when you're in the middle of a new story? Well, she says that's not just a coincidence. It's actually the first clue to a much, much bigger puzzle. And that puzzle brings us to our first section, the secret network of stories. See, the author believes that feeling of familiarity is real because we're tapping into this huge invisible web that connects all stories from the past and the present. She has this really great way of describing it. She calls them red threads. It's this idea that no story ever really exists on its own. Instead, every single one is part of this massive woven tapestry, constantly borrowing from and talking to all the other stories that came before. Now, this idea is built on a pretty established concept in literature called intertextuality. What she's arguing here is that to really get a story, you can't just look at it in isolation. You have to see it as one point of light in this almost infinite constellation of all the stories that have ever been told. So that brings us to our next section, texts that speak. This is where we look at how this whole network idea becomes a real theory about how stories actually communicate with each other, creating this kind of silent conversation that spans centuries.
And this is the key. Intertextuality isn't just about a writer being influenced by something they read. It's way more dynamic than that. Think of it less like someone copying a painting and more like a great DJ sampling an old school beat to create a completely new track with a whole new vibe and a new meaning.
Okay, but this is where the book introduces its really groundbreaking idea. If intertextuality is the network, the author says there's something even more fundamental going on, the actual code that's running through that network, and she calls it narrative DNA. This is the good stuff.
So, what is narrative DNA? Well, the idea is that these basic human struggles, our fears, our desires, they get encoded into story patterns. And these patterns, they act just like a genetic code. They get passed down from story to story, changing and adapting over time, but always, always keeping that core structure intact. And this chart just illustrates it perfectly. So you take Oedipus, right? He's fighting against a fate that he just cannot escape. Now think about a modern movie about a character who's totally haunted by some inescapable trauma from their childhood. The costumes, the setting, the language, they're worlds apart. But that narrative DNA, that deep core struggle against a truth you can't get away from, it's exactly the same. Now, this is where the whole thing just gets mind-blowing, because this idea moves out of literary theory and straight into the world of hard science. And honestly, this is what makes this book such a game changer. The author argues that this isn't just a cool metaphor. Our brains are quite literally hardwired to pick up on this narrative DNA. So that feeling of familiarity we talked about, it's not just something we've learned from culture. It's a deep-down biological reaction. And neuroscience actually backs this up, pointing to something called mirror neurons. When we see a character going through something, our brain doesn't just register it as information. It actually simulates the experience. It creates this biological bridge that lets us feel empathy, connecting our 21st century brain directly to a character from thousands of years ago. It's amazing. So when you get right down to it, storytelling isn't just for entertainment. As this quote gets at, it's a fundamental tool our brain uses. Our brains take all the chaos of life, of time passing, and use stories to sort it into a pattern that makes sense. And those fundamental patterns, that's the narrative DNA. Which brings us to our last section, you, the detective. Okay, so what in the world does all this mean for us, the people actually reading the books and watching the movies? Well, this is where our role gets a major upgrade, from just watching to actively participating. So, the author invites us to make a shift. We can stop being just passive recipients and instead become what she calls intertextual detectives. Instead of just letting a story happen to you, you're challenged to get in there and hunt for those red threads, look for the echoes of other stories, and actually help create the meaning yourself. And we can do this because writers are basically architects of intention. They build their stories with multiple layers. You've got the plot on the surface, sure,
But underneath, there are all these hidden connections and deeper meanings, just waiting there for a curious detective to come along and find them.
And here's the best part. You don't have to do this detective work all by yourself. When we share what we find, whether it's in a classroom, a book club, or just talking with friends, we become part of an interpretive community. And together, we give these ancient stories brand new life and make them relevant for our world, right now.
So, the ultimate takeaway here is really a challenge. The next time you sit down with a story, don't just be a spectator, be a detective. Hunt for those threads, look for the DNA, and ask yourself, what hidden connections will you discover?